This is Think Tank. I'm Gerald DeMattis. Welcome to all of you in Trinidad and Tobago and around the world. History is one of those subjects on the school curriculum that has consistently suffered from negative perceptions. So said Stephen Joseph in his 2012 study of 432 participants from selected secondary schools in Trinidad and Tobago. More recently, and as I say in my column, history at the tertiary level is waning in significance if we go by enrollment numbers. According to the UE Student Statistical Digest 2016 from 2017 to 2020, 2021, undergraduate enrollment in history has consistently dropped from 47 to 31. At the postgraduate level, the numbers are even more stark, from 1 in 2016 to 2017, and 1 in 2017 to 2018 to 0 in each of the following 3 academic years. It must be said, however, that the increasingly negative perception of the study of history by secondary school students is not unique to Trinidad and Tobago. A 2022 national study by the United States Department of Education revealed that scores had not only fallen consecutively since 2014, but is now below the 1994 level. V.S. Naipaul says in the middle passage that the history of the islands can never be satisfactorily told. But can it be taught differently? Here's what I think. While the perception of history education is certainly one that gives us reason to sit up, there are other issues in the orbit that are equally significant. Historical literacy, for example, critical thinking, and the awareness of historical methodology have far-reaching implications beyond what's already a difficult place for the future of history. So what can we do about the state of history education? It might be worthwhile to focus on not just the curriculum, but also the pedagogy. A 2021 doctoral dissertation by Patricia Edwards, which investigated perceptions of history education at the secondary school level in Jamaica, revealed 3 major findings. 1, possible career paths. 2, experience with teachers in history classes. And 3, writing and reading skills. It seems to me then that any attempt at reform of history curricula cannot occur in isolation. It has to be multi-pronged in a manner that addresses the dearth of meaningful employment available to history scholars, the pedagogy, and literacy more broadly. The stakes are too high to overlook the necessity of history education. Already for this year, the Caribbean Examinations Council, CXC, has declared that certain subjects will be discontinued, among them agricultural science. Nothing has been said of history, but by no means is it immune. Here with me today is Professor and historian Bridget Brereton. So talk to us about your professional and academic involvement in history, but also the changes you've witnessed in the teaching of history up to this point.
Well, it depends how far back you want to go. Now,
Yeah.
Gerald, I am very old, so I can go far back. When I was an undergraduate at UWI Mona, Jamaica, and this is the mid-1960s, so that tells you, I was privileged to be taught by some of the individuals who had in fact created an absolute transformation of the teaching of history in the region's secondary schools. I'm talking about luminaries like Elsa Gavaya, Roy Auger, Douglas Hall, Keith Lawrence, and others. If you go far back, and you know because you study literature, the experience of West Indians in secondary schools before, let me say, the mid-50s into 1960 was no Caribbean history of any kind. They did European history. If they were lucky, they did British history almost exclusively. A group of people, most of them based at the Mona campus in the history department there, set out to change it, and they did change it. So by the mid-50s and coming into the early 60s, nearly every secondary school in the Anglophone Caribbean was teaching West Indian history. They were also teaching British and European history. Nothing wrong with that, by the way, but they were definitely teaching West Indian history. And this was the period that the first modern textbooks on Caribbean history came out. I'm talking about classics by J.H. Parry and Sherlock, both connected to UWI Mona, The Making of the West Indies, Auger, Hall, Gordon, and Record. I remember the names up to now, and a few others. So this was a sea change. The next sea change, as you know, was the coming on stream of Caribbean Examinations Council, CXC. And again, lots of those people were at the forefront in creating CXC and particularly in crafting the CSEC, as we now call it, the O-level substitute syllabus. CSEC history came on stream, I think it was 1979. Most secondary schools in the Caribbean signed up, somewhat reluctantly in some cases, because they were attached to the Cambridge syllabuses, etc. Now the CSEC Caribbean history syllabus has changed, of course, over the decades since then. I am not completely au fait with how it is now, but on the whole, I do know it's subject to continuous review. There's a history panel. There are lots and lots of subject panels. There's a history panel, and it is subject to review. CAPE, substituting for A levels, came on stream in the 80s. I am better informed on the CAPE syllabus because for many years I was chief moderator, not chief examiner, let me say, but chief moderator. That means my job was to scrutinize the draft papers and pick up anything odd or anything wrong and so on. I think the CAPE syllabus is a perfectly decent syllabus. There is quite a lot in the syllabus about First Peoples. And of course, it is regional in scope. But as you well know, and you thoroughly depressed me in your opening monologue, as you well know, and we'll probably discuss this a little later, only a declining number opt for history at CSEC. Instead, nearly all the schools do social studies at CSEC, in which history is a little bit, along with geography, political science, sociology, etc., etc. The numbers who opt for history at CAPE is even smaller. Actually, TT sends more candidates to CAPE history than any other place. So that's the problem. Another problem is that both the CSEC and the CAPE syllabi, which, as I said, I think are perfectly decent syllabi, are regional in scope. And that, of course, is a deliberate decision. That is the remit of CXC. The result is that the national history can be lost. Much of the CSEC and CAPE syllabuses deal with Jamaica, which is the best researched of the Anglophone Caribbean, and to a lesser extent, Barbados, Guyana, Trinidad. But the national history is not salient in the CXC syllabi. There is room to teach the national history, particularly in forms 1 to 3, where, as you know, the children have not yet chosen their CSEC subject. And to me, that is where the national history should be inserted. Some schools do that, some schools don't. There are textbooks available. One of them written by me, so I should not advertise my own stuff. So two issues, not so much the quality of those syllabi, but the fact that relatively few do CSEC history, even fewer do CAPE history, and the national history, in my opinion, and the opinion of many, many other educators, does not really get a fair look in, except in a few schools which make a point of covering national history in forms 1 to 3 before everybody is streamed into their CSEC choices. I'm sure we'll come back to those points as we go on.
You mentioned the First Peoples, and history education about Indigenous peoples in particular, I had to get to not Cape, but university level to learn that the term Amerindians was now outdated. Now it's been a while since I've been in a classroom, a secondary school classroom, but in terms of the changes beyond that, are you aware of any changes to how we're using the terms, but also how do we attend to the specificity of the First Peoples without it being too complex, particularly given that it's part of national history and the Caribbean, but in terms of that national history that forms 1 to 3 level, how can we bridge that complexity and yet pay attention to the very unique experiences among those First Peoples?
Well, not easily is the quick answer, but I have to respectfully disagree. I think Amerindians is still a perfectly respectable and useful term. It is certainly still used by some of the modern up-to-date experts on the subject. I think it can be used along with Indigenous people, First Peoples. I think Amerindians is perfectly respectable. Forget Columbus and so on. I think the term, which has passed into common usage, it's not disrespectful in any way. So I still use it, and so do lots of other experts. Okay. As far as I know, and I might be wrong, the crude ancient Kerouac, I say Kerouacs, you understand how I fuse those together.
Yeah.
Arawak's good, Carib's bad dichotomy has been abandoned in the CSEC and Cape syllabi and in up-to-date textbooks and other publications. The term Kalina or Kalinago seems to be as close as we can possibly get to what the people who spoke, and this is where Carib still comes in, the people who spoke one of the Cariban family of languages, linguists use that term, the Cariban family of languages. Kalina or Kalinago seems to be as close as we can get to what those people called themselves. And as you know, the Kalina or Kalinago were the folks who were living on the northern coast of Trinidad when Columbus stumbled on this island, 1498, and they were the main ethnic group inhabiting Tobago in 1498. Then you had people who divided into different ethnic groups, but were all related and spoke one of, and here the word is respectable, one of the Arawakan family of languages. They appear to have called themselves Lokono, and Lokono translates as the people. All over the world, people name themselves in their language the people. If they were an isolated people, they were the only people as far as they knew. So Inuit, for example, translates as the people. So the Lokono, speaking one of several Arawakan languages, settled in much of southern and southwestern Trinidad. And they indeed divided up into different ethnic groups. Napoyo, which you know about because you wrote about the find in one of your columns, Napoyo and Yao and Sabayo and so on. So the First Peoples were complex. It's not easy necessarily to convey that to children. I think the CXC syllabuses attempt to do that. I want to tell you, I'm sure you know, but your listeners, about what in my opinion is by far the best up-to-date single volume book about the Indigenous peoples of Trinidad, and that is the book by Arie Boomert. Boomert is a Dutch scholar. He's everything. He's a Renaissance man. He's an archaeologist, a historian, and an anthropologist. And marvelously, he can read all the languages of the documents that tell us about the Indigenous people after European arrival. Remember, the indigenous people of Trinidad did not write.
Yeah.
And so our first documentary descriptions come from Spaniards, he reads Spanish, French visitors, he reads French, Dutch is his native language, and of course he reads English. So this book, it's called The Indigenous People of Trinidad and Tobago, from the First Settlers Until Today, Ari Boomer. It was published in 2016. It is lavishly illustrated. It is not written in an academic style. Now, I think it's too difficult, perhaps, for CSEC children.
Yeah.
Cape people can certainly use it, but it's a wonderful teacher resource. In particular, it's lavishly illustrated, and it indicates where some of the artifacts produced by our first peoples are to be found. So obviously, and later on, we're going to talk about teaching methods. Schools in Trinidad and Tobago can organize visits to places where these artifacts can be seen. I'm sorry to say the National Museum at this moment is closed for renovation, but I have to hope it will open soon. And they have a rich collection of First Peoples artifacts. And there are some in Tobago too, in the Tobago Museum and elsewhere. So visits to actually see these objects could be a very great teaching tool. Now, just to end this point, everywhere there is always a gap between new academic knowledge produced by the archaeologists and the historians and the textbooks children use in schools. That's inevitable. And the aim is to make the gap as short as possible. But in the meanwhile, teachers particularly can use a book like Brumert's book as a resource to help them teach the component or whatever it is they're teaching, in order, precisely as you say, to try to introduce children to the complexities and specificities of First People societies in Trinidad and Tobago and the region.
Now, in terms of your own writing, your public writing, let's call it, you wrote an article in 2019. It was titled History in Decline, ? And in that column, you referenced a Cape teacher who was calling for history as a core or prerequisite subject. Talk to us about that column within the context of your own involvement or any possible consultations you've had with stakeholders to make history a core prerequisite subject.
Well, this is a very long story, John. For decades, I am long retired, of course, but for decades, the department that I was part of, the Department of History at St. Augustine, has been engaged in those efforts from the very beginning. I joined that department as a graduate student in the late 60s and became a full-time lecturer in 1972. So we're going back a long way. The department has in many, many ways attempted to get across the idea of history as a core subject. And secondly, to go back to the point we had touched on earlier, to ensure that the national history is not lost in the cracks of the regional syllabi of CSEC and Cape. Some ministers of education have been very responsive, others less interested. You know that the secondary school program is dominated by exams and so on. And so the earlier problem about CSEC history being not the preferred option, instead the jumble, how shall I put it, the umbrella social studies is the preferred option. And at Cape, fewer and fewer people doing it. One reason for that, I have been told, is that it's much harder to get an A in Cape history than to get A's in other subjects. And the ambitious, academically oriented children and their parents are out for scholarships. And as you know, you got to have all perfect A's to get the scholarship. So that's one problem. Anyway, huge efforts have been made by the department, for several years now, they have my department has an annual, they call it History Fest. It's a 3-day series of events. They have always involved secondary school children and teachers. The most recent one was held in March of this year. And from time to time, there has been a lively body called the History Teachers Association of TNT. Now, you know how these things go. You have a couple of keen people and they carry it through and they leave or lose interest or have children or building a house or whatever it is, and so on. I don't think it's been very active in recent years, but it was very active and it organized all kinds of events and so on. So the only thing I can say to you is my younger colleagues in the Department of History now, keep trying, keep talking to the people in the Ministry of Education. We've always had good relationships with the curriculum supervisors, you know, who deal with history among other subjects. I think it's subsumed in the social studies portfolio. And as I said, from time to time, we've had useful discussions with ministers of education. It's a marathon, not a sprint, and we just have to keep trying. And you yourself and your program can help too, I think, and your columns.
Yeah, I think one of the major things I recently learned was, and I had to be told this, was CXC is an examination syllabus, not teaching syllabus.
You've got it.
Yeah, and I suppose, yeah, and therefore perhaps that's the biggest sort of change we could hope for some kind of delicate balance between teaching and examining.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of reform to history and pedagogy, how history is taught, in your opinion, what would a reformed history curriculum look like? And now we could probably talk national history, because I would imagine that that's the one thing we have control over, as opposed to the CXC reform. So what might a reformed national history curriculum look like to you?
I want to move from curriculum to pedagogy, as you mentioned. I think teachers at every level, and let's say this would include upper primary level, I know those forms are absolutely dedicated 110% to SEA, but nevertheless, there may be a space there, but particularly forms 1 to 3 of the secondary school. I think teachers have more flexibility there. They are not governed by a rigid syllabus. And I think teachers must try to be innovative. No, I know it's easy for me to say that, and try to use a wide range of teaching methods. By all means, those teachers should make sure their knowledge base is up to date. And so if you're teaching First Peoples in TNT, get Boomer, make your library, get a copy if it has, make the school library get a copy if it hasn't already. And maybe you yourself could invest a couple $100 in getting a copy of the book. So make sure your knowledge base is secure and up to date, but use everything. Videos, look for movies, look for documents. Even at forms 1 to 3, there are some documents that you could find which you could make the subject of a class discussion. You know, because you're very young, what Instagram reels are. I didn't know until recently, but one thing what History Fest this year did was have a competition for kids in upper primary, lower secondary, and upper secondary to do little reels about historical topics. Some of them, let me tell you, were brilliant. Visit every museum, every historical site that you are able to visit. It'd be easier for some than others. Local history. There are SBAs, as you know, at CSEC and Cape, but even before then, there are little local history projects children can do. Go and interview your granny. It can be as simple as that. Interview your granny and talk to the class about what your granny experienced. What about researching the history of your own school? What about the history of your suburb, your church, your mosque, your mandir, community organizations? the opportunities of making even children as young as 11, 12, 13, 14 do little bits of research on family history and local history, which can feed into the wider understanding of national history. I think that that kind of thing is really very promising school-based research project. And finally, teachers of history and social studies should be aware of the resources and the organizations that exist in the country. The National Trust, after a long period of being moribund, has exploded into life over the last 5, 6, 7 years. It is an extremely active body, does all kinds of things, lectures, Zoom talks, visits, trips, tours. The National Archives, one of the best kept secrets in Trinidad and Tobago. It is a functioning archive. It is open to the public. I don't think little children can go and use the materials, but I'm pretty sure that school visits can be arranged if appointments are made, so that even fairly young children, secondary school children, can see the documents on which national history is based. National Trust, National Archives, National Museum and Art Gallery. Yes, it's closed at this moment, but it will reopen. It has a fine collection of First Peoples artifacts and a lot of other stuff too. Heritage Library, that's NALIS in the National Library building. So I think that history teachers should become aware, educate themselves on all the organizations that exist and team up with them wherever possible. The last point I want to make, because I realize your time is limited. It is to me ironical that the decline in history as taught in the secondary schools and at university, I don't mean decline in the sense it's getting worse and worse taught. I mean decline in the sense of enrollment, what you began the program with. It is juxtaposed to what I see as a far greater public interest in the history of TNT. And I picked that up in the press, in columns like your own, and in many other columns. The columns that I myself did for many, many years, I'm told I had a devoted following. That may or may not be true. The book I published based on those columns has sold much better than I ever expected it would. The National Trust often puts on tours and visits which are sold out, and they're not cheap. You have to pay for them. There's a far greater interest in family history, genealogical history, the kind of thing that Shamsuddin pioneered decades ago, and lots of other people, lots of other families have family histories, family reunions, that kind of thing. So family history, local history, history of a church, a mosque, a mandir, public interest reflected in the press and in the social media. So I'm told, because I am not a social media person. So there's a lack of fit between those two developments. I don't fully understand it, but I think we have to exploit as much as we can what I see as a resurgence of interest in the public in learning more about their history. Now, obviously, events like African Emancipation Day, which we're going to celebrate next week, Indian Arrival Day, and all the others, they stimulate interest in aspects of our past. Newspapers put out supplements, as you would know, to commemorate those two public holidays. And so things are going on, events are happening, organizations are developing. We have a newly resurgent reparations committee. Whether you agree with reparations or not, that body is going to help to stimulate consciousness about our First Peoples history, as well as the history of enslavement and what happened to Africans after the end of enslavement. So we need to exploit, as you are doing, the resurgence in public interest in the national history.
Yeah, so many good things you mentioned. I mean, just going off of the Instagram bit for example, we talk about digital humanities in this very academic way, but a simple thing like visiting a landmark, historical landmark, and uploading that to Instagram, it creates an archive in itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And some of the children who participated in the department's competition in March did just that. For example, the prize winning for a particular category was a reel about a visit to the Diego Martin water wheel.
Yeah.
And it was brilliantly done. So exactly, you would you would visit as part of a school trip, probably, or possibly with your family, and you could produce a brilliant little reel, which, as you say, becomes an archival component.
And the territory is also ripe for that. I remember the late Angelo Bissessa Singh, whose snapshots created such a splash in Trinidad. And the virtual museum. So there's a lot of we just need to generate the excitement, perhaps, and rekindle that energy in history and the study of history. Professor Brereton, I want to thank you so much for being part of our think tank.
Thank you very much for asking me, and all the best with your program.
Of course. And to everyone listening and watching, see you next time.